Good evening, everybody, and welcome to another session of hashtag Gather to Grow here with Food from Zanzi on Twitter Spaces. My name is Dawn Numdu. I'm your host for this evening, and I hope that wherever you are, you had a fruitful day. Thank you so much for being here and for joining this discussion, specifically talking about agriculture and agricultural heritage and why fostering agricultural heritage is key for growth. I'm going to start with Agnes Hope. She's a newbie to Twitter Spaces, and she is the director of African Women in Agriculture. Thank you so much for joining us, Agnes. It's so great to have you with me. And this is not the first type of panel discussion that I'm hosting that you're part of. You were also part of our Food from Zanzi Young Farmers Indaba, and I'm so grateful to have you back and to pick your brain once again. Welcome. Maybe just a bit about yourself, where your journey in agriculture started for those who might not know you.
Good evening. Thanks, Dawn, for hosting this discussion. As you've said, my name is Agnes. I would say a relatively new farmer with a passion for agriculture, mostly a passion to develop young female farmers. And we've been doing that for the last 4 years. Our organization is African Women in Agriculture, AWIA. We develop women in agriculture through an incubator. We have short programs. So our programs range from 3 days to 1 year long. We teach agriculture and entrepreneurship as a combination so that the women learn how to run their farms or run their agricultural businesses, but also just commercialize it, make sure that it's a viable entity. For myself, I have a master's degree in strategy. I've got a business degree in business, and I have worked through corporate South Africa, a lot of the time in mining in the nonprofit space.
Thank you so much. And I think it's so amazing, to hear people's journeys in agriculture and how much they contribute to this very dynamic space that we all work and literally live in. Thank you so much for being here. Then I also have Dr. Lerato Amato. She's from the Agricultural Research Council, geneticist by trade, and she's now focusing on specifically supporting farmers within the agri space. Dr. Lerato, thank you so much for joining me once again on this platform. It's not your first time, and again, I'm so happy to be able to pick your brain once again and get your insights on this very important topic that we'll be focusing on tonight.
Thank you very much for having me. For those that do not know which agricultural sphere I'm dabbling into, I'm currently working on farmer support, commercialization, and enterprise development, and I'm grateful to be part of this conversation.
Thank you so much for being here. Then I also have Siyabonga Velakazi, who is the Deputy Director for the Training Directorate at the KwaZulu-Natal Department of Agriculture and Rural Development. Of course, also one of those people in agriculture that you just want to sit and have a conversation with all day. Thank you so much for joining us once again, Siyabonga. It's great to have you with us. Maybe just for those who might not know you, a bit about yourself.
Thank you, Don, for the invite again. Thank you to the listeners for joining. I am Siyabonga Vilakazi. I am a young gentleman who studied agriculture at one of the 11 agricultural colleges and then studied further on at the University of Free State. I've been involved in the training directorate or training of young farmers in structured learning, possibly for the past 18 years. Started off at Sedara College, a crop technician, and then moved on to be a lecturer in agronomy, and had the opportunity of also leading the academic component or part or higher education learning here at Sedara College as vice principal before being scooped up by the Western Cape Department of Agriculture, where I was based at Olsenburg for a period of 2 years. Also involved in the diploma and B-Agric programs, looking after both animal and plant husbandry there. Then returned back to my home province, KwaZulu-Natal, last year as principal of Untitled College of Agriculture in Northern Natal. My hometown again won me over, and been back here at Sedara College, also looking after training within the higher education component for the past 6 months.
Thank you so much for sharing your insights again with us here on Food from Zanzi's Gather to Grow. And again, dynamics in this very interesting space that we all work in. Last but not least, Kagiso is an agronomist and farmer. Kagiso, maybe just a bit about yourself, where you're based, what you do in the agri space, and more just about you.
Hi, Don, and the other speakers and listeners. My name is Kagisho Muro. I am a farmer in Gauteng province, Tshwane region, and I'm doing mixed farming. My formal education is in crop science. I hold a master's degree in crop science, and I've been around. I've been with ARC. I've worked for the commercial farms around Nelspruit in the subtrop region. So yes, and I also lead a youth organization called the Youth in Agriculture and Rural Development in the Gauteng province. I am the Secretary General of the Tshwane region.
Thank you so much for joining us once again and for sharing your insights and for being here. South Africa has a split agricultural identity, which means that there are two heritage streams and it has very unique identity. On the one side, it is the mass subsistence production, and on the other side, we have large scale commercial production. But both groups feel very strongly about their identities. I thought we could maybe kick off the discussion here and maybe just get the views from our speakers and even the people listening tonight, what they think about this and where they fit in, just to start off the conversation. Agnes, can I start with you?
We develop female smallholder farmers. So obviously we deal on the one side of the spectrum with the smaller non-commercial farmers, those who are struggling to access funds, resources, and tools, and also just the expertise to equip themselves as farmers to compete in our ever-changing world. Based on your point and your question, yes, there is a difference in the two agricultural heritage groups, as you're calling them, the smallholder and commercial farmers. Commercial farmers are way better resourced. Smallholder farmers, as much as they would like to become commercial, need the resources. And that's the one thing that we are fighting for, is to try and secure more resources for smaller farmers so that they can compete, access bigger markets, and grow into the commercial space.
And I think this is definitely an important factor and a struggle that's been coming on for a while. What would you say on this, Siyabonga, just in terms of this very strong divide and these very strong agricultural identities and heritage systems within our agricultural space that we work in on a day-to-day basis?
Both sectors obviously play a pivotal role within the South African context. And I think one of the main aspects which have indicated to us that agriculture is most certainly one of the most sustainable sectors and has remained strong and alive right through the COVID pandemic, and how the GPD, it's contributed significantly to the GPD significantly over the past 2.5, 3 years since COVID came across our lives. I think one of the most critical aspects which obviously consistently separates the two is a matter of knowledge. And obviously a lot of people, especially in the small scale holder farming, are still using a lot of indigenous and native methods, and there's a lot of technology which is becoming readily available. On the other hand, you find that the commercial sector has moved yards and steps ahead and is constantly moving further and further ahead. But I think both are critical and contribute significantly to our heritage. And you'll find that as well in terms of even the small scale or subsistence farmer, they contribute significantly as well within just normal livelihoods and society as a whole, whether somebody has produced, be it a quarter of a hectare of dry beans, which might be too much in some instances for them, consume within their family, but there's still a lot of those farmers who are also operating in the former or older methods of doing things, not necessarily always doing it for cash or money, but in other instances for bartering of items and so forth. So I think both sectors play a significant role and contribute quite significantly to the livelihood, and also contributing to obviously our nutritional needs as a whole.
Thanks so much, Siyabonga. And then maybe just your take, Dr. Lerato, in terms of the work that you're doing to specifically support these smaller subsistence and smaller farmers within the country. And I then ask my next question, just your take on that as well.
I think before I respond to your question, it's very important that we share a bit of history in terms of the commercial sector. If you remember, back in the apartheid era, what happened was that the apartheid government used to fully fund farmers, white farmers, in terms of production, and they got the full spectrum of support, that being from the implements that they need to the production inputs, etc. And this support got to a point whereby the black farmers that were also within the industry got swallowed by the commercial farmers. And some of them had their land, sold their land to commercial farmers to a point whereby there's a nice quote that was indicated in one of the publications that says that the black farmers ended up being workers for the commercial farmers. So with that, a bit of history. Yes, the commercial sector is thriving because they have high outputs in terms of their production. And then on the other side, you have the small scale sector, which is mostly black farmers. And these are characterized as being the resource poor farmers, as well as those that have insufficient knowledge because of the unstructured agricultural extension service that we have. So in the line of work that I do, we are trying to conduct research that will enhance the productivity of these small scale or resource poor or emerging farmers. And in addition, we're working at ensuring that the technology transfer component which these resource poor farmers need is in place through us, whereby we share with them the different technologies that are available that can enhance their agricultural production.
Thanks, Dr. Lerato, and I actually hope to touch on this later as the discussion continues. It's been 28 years since the agricultural industry obviously had to identify both groups as legitimate farming communities in South Africa. And the OECD recently published a report that 1.9 people are living in a state of fragility. How can our evolving agricultural heritage contribute to this diversity in diets and greater food security? I think this is such an important point to make, and I'd like to get your insights on that as well. Kagiso, would you maybe like to take this one? And then I'll also ask my other speakers to contribute. Thanks.
Dr. Lerato has said, given our history, the black farmers have been actually robbed a great deal because they will be playing quite a very pivotal role in terms of the diet diversification. We look at your indigenous vegetables, they are no longer be planted anymore. They've introduced the likes of cabbage and spinach, and people now are no longer eating the indigenous vegetable such as your clomi, your cowbee, which actually has high amounts of calcium, ions, and vitamins. So the diversity, even if people would still want to go back, when you look at the big commercial farmers, the seed producers, they are not interested in that segment of the economy. So I think then it will be quite important for the likes of ARC to go back and try to inculcate the old culture of growing our indigenous vegetable for us to diversify the diets, and that will help also in terms of food security. But the biggest challenge, it's going to be the big retails. They are still very rigid. They don't want to welcome the indigenous food that is known by the indigenous people of South Africa. So we still have a long way to go in that regard because that has been perpetuated for quite some time.
Thank you so much. And I think it's so fitting that we actually have a representative here from the Agricultural Research Council to maybe also share her take on that and the importance of fostering this agricultural heritage and the food that we eat and the diversity of it. There was a big upward trend of late of products that people started growing and reintroducing as crops to grow and export and produce both here and other parts of the world. Dr. Lerato, what's your take on that?
At the Agricultural Research Council, as Mura has indicated, we are working tirelessly to reintroduce these, they call them African leafy vegetables, your amaranth, tepe, your cowpeas, your cleome, back into our rural community as well as the urban communities, given their nutritional value, which supersedes the commercially available vegetable crops that are currently in the market. So we are doing numerous research activities aimed at this. I mean, looking at drought tolerance, we're looking at agro-processing, looking at products that we can develop that will ease the introduction of these products into the mainstream and also obviously the rural communities. And the aim of this is looking at broadening the food basket, given the fact that a lot of communities are food insecure. Looking at these two dynamics that you mentioned earlier, the commercial versus the smallholder farmers or the small scale farmers, from the studies that I've done and observations that I've done, we found that the small scale farmers are well positioned to be the ones that drive the food security ventures within these communities, be it rural communities or the urban communities. Because, for example, studies have shown that within the potato industry, you find that 54,000 hectares of potato plus, 54,000 plus hectares of potatoes are planted within South Africa. And of the 54,000 hectares that are planted, almost more than 56% of that ends up in the informal market. Where is the informal market? In your locations, in your rural communities, etc., etc. Therefore, if we work tirelessly to train these smallholder farmers for them to support these rural communities and your recently termed urban poor, it will mean that we would be able to be better positioned to drive the change that is needed to the diet of those rural communities as well as the so-called urban poor.
Thank you so much, Dr. Lerato. Maybe want to just bring in something that Agnes mentioned earlier about technology. I'm not sure if you mentioned it, Kagiso, as well. New technology in agriculture is definitely changing the face of how producers look today. How are new growers developing methods to create this new identity? And do you think it will kind of impact current farming and older systems that used to exist? Do you think it's phasing out completely? And what does the future actually look like? Siyabonga, would you maybe like to take this one? And I'd also like to get Agnes's take on it.
In terms of the development over the 28 years, there's something I'd like to share or give everyone, both panel and our listeners, something to think about. And I think perhaps over time, maybe over even more than the 28 years, perhaps over half a century, with the impact climate change has had and how things have changed. I think firstly, we can certainly all agree that it's made agriculture more difficult. It eliminated a lot of the borderline farmers who were farming, be it 40, 30 years ago, depending on the commodity or enterprise that they were doing. I think climate change has really thrown off the wagon the farmers who were really on a border case line and not highly conducive or suited to the environmental conditions under which they find themselves, be it the climate or the natural resources. Hence, people have had to modify and look quite intently and closely in terms of what they're doing, why they're doing it, and their scale of production. And I think just a simple example to think of, if you've been around for the past 30 years and here in Natal, and you think of how many dairy farmers we had in milk production 30 years ago, and you look at it now. Back in the days, 30 years ago, you would have had numerous dairy farmers, some only as small as milking 80 cows. Nowadays, it's become such a cutthroat business that if you're milking anything under 500 cows, you either need to sell it off to someone because it's not worth processing it through for yourself. Then the second element in both sectors, which I'd like us to think of and look into under both the subsistence or small-scale farmers as well as commercial farmer, is that of aging of our farmers on both sides of the coin. What you find in most instances in our small-scale holder farmers and subsistence farmers is that mainly a lot of those are the older folks, because what has happened over time, there hasn't been proper successional plan where you find that the younger children or younger folk are more interested in moving towards town and their greater prospects in developing another career away from the homelands or the rural areas. And you find that's how our subsistence or small-scale holder farmers have fallen through the cracks as well in terms of their production, where the older folks obviously becoming tired over time and not being as productive as they can. And I think it's also the very same scenario case with our commercial production. We're constantly told of the average age of commercial farmers within South Africa, and how we've got to counteract that to remain viable and sustainable.
Thank you. You're raising very important points. And I think it was also something that we had discussed at our recent Indaba, and I see Duncan is also here. Duncan, do you have a specific question based on the topic that you'd like to ask? Duncan, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Dawn. Good evening to all our speakers, everyone tuned in. It's such a great conversation to have. I see some familiar faces here, Dawn, Agnes, Dr. Lerato, and everyone else. I want to actually piggyback on something Dr. Lerato said about financing early on. We know that funding constraints facing black farmers and entry barriers in commercial farming are two of the key reasons why most farmers fail in the country. Even with that said, it hasn't been all doom and gloom. The sector has doubled since 1990, but funding remains a problematic area for especially black farmers. A question to you, Dr. Lerato, maybe some of your other speakers can also answer. How do we narrow the divide between black and white farmers in South Africa in terms of access to finance? Because that is a big issue with farmers talking to us on a daily basis with regards to that struggle.
Thanks, Duncan. I just want to make sure that we're also clarifying that it's this divide that we've been talking about since the beginning of the discussion. Very large commercial scale farmers and more smaller subsistence producers in the country. Dr. Lerato, the floor is yours.
As I mentioned with the history, you would find scenarios whereby the commercial farmers were supported for a number of years, and this was to a point whereby they were sustainable. Now, what our current government is doing is that they're throwing a tractor at a farmer. They're throwing seeds at a farmer. They're throwing maybe a couple of beehives at a farmer. And they come back 2 or 3 years later and they say that this farmer is not productive and we've given the farmer a tractor. But then how do I become functional if I'm given a tractor, but I need to buy diesel, but I don't have the money to buy diesel? How do I become productive if I have a tractor staring at me 24/7, but I've got employees that I need to pay? And you find instances whereby the government then goes back and says that we gave that farmer a tractor. We went back to the small scale farmer. When you find that the farmer sold the tractor, you would ask the farmer, why did you sell the tractor? And they'll tell you the very same reasons. I had workers that I needed to pay. So I saw that instead of having a tractor where I need to have money for diesel, I need to hire implements, etc., I'd rather settle for selling that tractor, getting the money and investing the money into my production. So bridging the divide means that with the funding that the government has in terms of CASP and ILIMA, it needs to be a holistic type of support that the farmers get. And the government needs to move away from this notion that we are throwing a lot of things and a lot of money at the farmers, but our farmers have this dependency syndrome. No, that's not how it works. Dependency syndrome is only created when you have sparse type of support that you give the farmer, but you're not looking at the full enterprise and facilitating and implementing certain measures that will ensure that the farmer, after 3 or 4 years, but in most cases it's always been shown to be 3 years, after 3 years of full support, working with the full enterprise, the farmer will be able to be sustainable and independent. But going back to also what Sia also mentioned earlier with regards to the heritage and the agricultural sector for these two farmers, the one thing that I've noticed is that with commercial farmers, they are pushing towards production, increasing their profit. So they're becoming more mechanized. That is them adopting technologies. They're becoming more mechanized and using those high throughput equipment to make sure that they increase productivity. And on the downside, they're increasing application of agrochemicals, which becomes a danger to the ecosystem. They're increasing the use of fertilizers, which are also contributing towards degradation of the land. But for the hereditary part of it, what I like about a lot of commercial white farmers is that the hereditary part of it is that they have their kids as part of the labor force within the farm, meaning that as soon as the parent goes over a certain age, the child has already gained a lot of experience and is able to continue with the enterprise or the specific business the family was in. And that's where you find continuation. On the other side, when it comes to small scale farmers, what I love and what I've observed is that with the small scale farmers, because they have a very limited size of land that they have at their disposal to use. They're implementing a lot of climate smart agricultural techniques, even though some of them are not aware that is part of climate smart agriculture, whereby they're introducing a bit of more organic farming to rehabilitate the soil. They're also practicing a lot of conservation agriculture, including no-till, etc., etc. So on both sides, yes, there's hereditary activities that are taking place, but for these both sides, the practices are on the opposite side of the scale.
Thanks, Dr. Lerato. I think you've shared a lot of pertinent points to this conversation, and I'd maybe like to hear from the farmer in the house as well. Kagiso, thinking about everything that Dr. Lerato has said, what's your take as a farmer, and specifically with the adoption of new technologies? Mechanization is key at this point for anyone who's in the industry. And I think for me, the biggest thing is also just focusing on that generational knowledge and support that is not often there for new farmers just starting out in the industry.
Thanks, Don. The difference between the subsistence farmers, who are mostly resource poor, and the commercial farmers, they actually strike a very good deal, because when you were to look at the problem of climate change, your smallholders will not use too much fertilizers. They don't have mechanization, so they'll be practicing zero tillage. So if we want to cap the challenge of climate, I think those are the groups to be targeted. But the unfortunate part is that going through that route, it's quite expensive and it does not pay the bills, because we are talking economics of scales. So your big commercial farmers will obviously adopt the technology that will enhance their productivity by using of drones and any other technology at their disposal. But the same technology is not going to be available to smallholder farmers or subsistence farmers. So we are actually perpetuating the same divisions that actually happened in the apartheid era. So they will not catch up. So our leaders or the government needs to be very careful, or the industry itself, on how are we going to incorporate the two systems so that they can coexist. Because if we're to look at your organic farming is not going to feed the world. That's a reality. You still need to use quite a lot of fertilizers if you want high yields of your crops. And I mean, your investors, the banks, they want their money back. So then it's like now the situation where you have an egg and a chicken scenario. Which one comes first? What do you do? In that sense, I think there just need to be a balance. But the climate change is catching up. The population growth is also at a very alarming rate. So we actually have a serious problem. But mostly your commercial farmers would not adopt methods that will seek to preserve our land and rehabilitation of our land. They will continuously use fertilizers because it pays the bills.
Thanks, Kagiso. To wrap up the conversation, I want to talk about how we will start bridging this divide between these two groups. But before we get there, I'm going to bring Agnes into the conversation again, because in South Africa, almost 1 million women are considered to be farmers, but the focus is still primarily on men. How do we actively encourage girl children to join our agricultural schools? Because you still mostly see boys. I work with a lot of strong women in agriculture, so I know that there are strong female producers, but the gap is still very clear. What does that mean for our heritage and the nation's future? Agnes, maybe you can just respond firstly on this question, and then I also like to get Siyabonga's take on it as well.
From the women's perspective, I think when Dr. Lerato was talking about sustainability, and that's one of the biggest challenges we face as women farmers as well, is the longevity and sustainability of the female farmers. Because I think we all need to survive out of necessity, and what pays the bills is obviously first priority for every farmer. The cost of production is a huge concern for most farmers, male and female. A lot of females do not own land, or they do not have access to land. So once you don't have access to land, you don't have access to the tools of production. You don't have access to facilities that will enable you to access funding, money, tools, equipment, and everything that farmers need to enable them to succeed. So women start already on a back foot. So that's the reason why we exist, is to try and support the women. And having run a full year's program, what we've discovered is it's not long enough. Once you've finished with the ladies after a year, you've given them the training, the development, they get their resources, 1 year is not enough to allow somebody to succeed. They need a lot more hand-holding. They need a lot more support and development. Once you start to grow, you go into areas like quality checks because you're supplying larger chains who require specific quality standards to be met. So it's actually a very difficult world, and there's very many gatekeepers, a lot of them financial, that keep a lot of young women and women in general out of it. And although we even have women now studying agriculture, a lot of them will develop careers in other areas out of necessity and not stay in the farming industry.
Very sad, but true reality. Siyabonga, what's your take on this, especially, from an agricultural training perspective, the question around financing and accessing financing and specifically land?
One of great concern, and I think perhaps the exposure aspect is not one which we should start only considering once they've finished high school and at tertiary level. I think it needs to be from the very onset, from our junior phases of education at primary school. I think the first and foremost context is that it's still viewed, agriculture, especially in terms of our rural community, it's still viewed as a form of punishment, and hence a lot of people do not have the vision or envisage themselves making a career out of it, firstly. And I think secondly, within our education system as well, I think there's still a need for greater support and emphasis in bringing and absorbing the women to come more and more involved. But as I've indicated as well, from a very onset, and perhaps it's high time our education system started developing these junior schools or primary schools primarily for women in agriculture, just like we've got the Oprah School of Leadership and so forth. Because what I also pick up when the ladies do come through higher education here at agricultural colleges with the practical training, they tend to also hold back a lot, especially you see it a lot during practical time. I'm not sure whether it's being overpowered or will allow the gentleman to dominate. And you find that obviously you, as a lecturer or as a technician, you end up needing to balance the occasion out here, guys. We're all going to graduate with a diploma at the end, so everyone needs to be hands-on and so forth. And then I think an interesting aspect is that of accessibility to land, especially I'll speak on behalf of the small-scale holders or subsistence farmers in the rural areas and so forth. You'll find that the women will always struggle to access land, be it from the local leadership or traditional leadership, despite perhaps the chief seeing that ladies co-op is doing very well and needs to expand. And there are obviously these protocols which we still need to break within the various forms of leadership to allow more exposure and accessibility to a lot of the resources to be made readily available to women.
Thanks, Siyabonga, and I think you raised a number of important points. I've had this same conversation over and over again, but I think we still have a long way to go. Zabian, your comment or insights on tonight's topic, the floor is yours. Maybe just an introduction to those who might not know you.
My name is Zabian. I'm a farmer and then I do new business development for John Deere. So I actually want to touch on the points that Duncan and the doctor made before, talking about the imbalance in the markets. A little bit of agricultural history as well. So in the olden days, back before 1996, there used to be boards. All the markets that we find today, the free market system that we have adopted in South Africa was always governed by government. So you used to have the maize board, the meat board, the vegetable board, the wool board. So a farmer could go out and produce. Before he even started produce, you would already know what price he's going to get. So in apartheid, the farmers had a saying that says, look in front of you, the government will look after you. That has changed a lot. So what then happened after 1996 when this boards was disbanded and we went into a free market system, farmers were left on their own, but not 100% on their own. The bigger farmers went back to that system and said, listen, we must create this safety net for ourselves. So what I'm actually trying to say is to become commercially sustainable, this is the first point I want to raise. You need to have the end in mind first. So I was last week speaking to farmers, a white commercial farmer who was already got his contracts in place for his maize production. So before he even plowed the field, he knows exactly what he's going to get at the end of the season. He has put in his prices, he has fixed his contracts. So his production, his fertilizer, his mechanization, his diesel cost, everything will be covered by the contracted price that Silo Strat, for example, or any Suffix trading company has given him. The rest he will do in the free market. So there's where he's going to make a profit, or he's going to create a lot of wealth, or the prices is going to drop and he's going to make a loss on it. But that's where he plays around with money. I think black commercial farmers or black aspiring commercial farmers need to start focusing on that. We need to get to a point where the end must be more important than even starting. I've spoken to a very big watermelon farmer. He already secured over 70 links of watermelons and he hasn't even planted yet. The point I'm trying to make is if we don't get to that point as black commercial farmers, we will always struggle because we produce, we absorb all the fertilizer prices, we absorb the expensive equipment that you need. And then at the end of the day, by the time we want to sell, the market has dropped because we know agriculture is seasonal. So instead of getting 4,800 for your maize, now you're getting 3,200 because you're selling at that point. So there's a challenge. And another quick thing I want to mention is the mechanization needs. Our farmers, we need to help each other to work on our economics of mechanization. Today, I was dealing with a lot of farmers where I realized we don't understand the economics behind what equipment I need. What is the right size for my farm? It's beautiful to have the biggest tractor out there. In this case, say, for example, a nice 8 Series John Deere. But that thing costs you 4 million. To maintain it a year will cost you around 300,000. Maybe for now, you just need that tractor that is 400,000 and not even a new one. Maybe a one from 10 years back. But because sometimes we don't understand economics and government just hands out tractors, we end up with the wrong tractor on the farm. And that costs us a lot of money. And that's why we can't get out of the blocks when it comes to commercialization of our produce.
Thanks, Zabian. And I think you've answered a lot of questions that we had. And it actually brings me to my last point around as we are building heritage, where do we think the link should be? And where are we growing to? And how do we bridge this divide between these two groups? And you've answered that very beautifully. And is it something that we can sort of manage, or is it something that happens organically? And maybe just as a last round, get this take from everyone who's speaking here tonight.
I would love the farmers on these platforms and stuff. I need farmers to come together to create the end goal. We need to create our markets because, like we said, we are being marginalized. We sometimes do get better, not the same prices for our produce. So what we need to do is to say, let's focus on the end because the primary production will always be there and it's the most important part. But let's start getting our own trading platforms. Let's start, not our own, but let's have a say in what are we going to get at the end of the day for our products because our quality is getting there. But where we lack is the silo trades, the big companies in this industry, they still govern us and we don't have a say at that table. We need to get a space at that table.
Definitely, we all want a seat at that table. Agnes, what's your take on this? Just the last takeaway, and specifically around, building heritage and if it's something that can be managed and if it's something that happens organically, and what does the future actually look like?
I think Zabian said a lot of what we need to do, which is the collaborative agreements. As farmers, we cannot go at it alone. We need each other, and the quicker we realize that, the better. We are not commercial, so smallholder farmers need to come together. And there are various platforms, including the ones that you host at Food for Mzansi. We need to make use of these, collaborate, work together, and see where our similarities are, how we can build on our strengths and move forward. And I just wanted to add one point on the heirloom and heritage foods in terms of our diet. During the time of COVID, a lot of people started taking in things like mplonyani, eating amaranth. So all those heirloom seeds and heirloom foods have started being produced in bigger quantities and people have started to sell and buy them. It's a slow process, but if we come together, we will increase the quantities and create new heritage of eating heirloom foods.
Thank you so much. During COVID, everyone was looking for this a plant that I remember my mom, forcing me to drink whenever I had stomach cramps. Wilder else is what they call it. And for me, it was like one of those oh my word, this is absolutely amazing. And I think we definitely need to push for that. Dr. Lerato, just your final comments and also where are we building towards and how can we manage this and create this new future where we foster agricultural heritage?
Going forward, I'm very happy with the recently endorsed agricultural and agro-processing master plan because it also allows for smallholder or small-scale farmers to have a say and also to have maximum input or impact within the agricultural sector. But I like what the previous speakers had mentioned, collaboration, collaboration, collaboration. If you look at an entity, so it says a lot of the commodity groups that we have now, the wide established commodity groups, a lot of them stem from collaboration. You have your Griqualand Koperasi, you have Northwest Koperasi, and it's a group of farmers that started working together, and ultimately through the collaboration, they managed to form this cooperative or this consortium which allowed them to have maximum impact within the agricultural sector. And lastly, it is very crucial and important for especially the developing farmers to ensure that they understand their enterprises and see the different components of the value chain within their enterprise of interest and see how they can participate in the various components of the value chain. In that way, with the limited land that they have, they'll be able to become commercial in their own small space and become sustainable for the future.
Thank you so much for that comment, Dr. Lerato. Siyabonga and Kagiso, your last take. Kagiso, can maybe take you first?
Unfortunately, with the current situation in South Africa, we are perpetuating the division. I've been part of one of the master plans, the broiler master plan. There is actually a room for both commercial white farmers and commercial black farmers to coexist. These guys are so resistant. When you look at the broiler master plan alone, the opportunities that are there, because one of the issues the farmers were actually complaining about, the white farmers, they're saying we need tariffs because of dumping and all of that. Yes, dumping to a certain extent it exists, but when we do the tariffs, who does it really help? Because in reality, we are not producing enough chicken to feed South Africa as things stand. Some of you might not believe. And when now we are saying we should increase local production, when we are increasing local production, that on its own says it means the grain industry as well need to increase their production. And they're holding this information to themselves. And I can tell you now, if your big corporations like your AFGRI, they know that they need to produce more maize, they can actually go to any farmer and say, you know what, we need so much tonnage for this coming season. They have the in-house financing systems, but they don't disclose that to black people. Most white farmers, especially in the broiler industry, what they do, they have just few black people so that when they go to government, they actually say, no, we have actually helped Dr. Lerato and so and so. When you look at how they've been helped, it was not a coordinated system. It was to their benefit. Most of their commercial farmers, they are renting the old farms that belong to white people because they want government to come and build the new developed structures. In that sense, I think we still have a long way to go. We develop an agri-fund to help these farmers, and now the criterion that seek to help is actually applying to white people or somebody who has money already. The unfortunate part is that some of our senior officials, when they get to this discussion table, they don't understand how these guys play the game. So we can say so many things that black people are disadvantaged, they can't do A, B, C, D. The system hasn't changed. Once the system changed, then we can start talking. We can say whatever we want, but we're not getting anywhere, unfortunately. Sad story of our agriculture colleges, they are dilapidated. We have seen on the carte blanche what is happening. So it tells you that our government, especially senior officials, either they don't understand what they're doing or they are deliberately working with the other party to actually disadvantage us.
Thanks, Kagiso. I think you've hit us very strong with very harsh realities that many farmers in this country face and deal with day to day. And I think we can't shy away from that. And I hope that like conversations like these and making small changes that we will see a difference. But we do have a long way to go, and I can't disagree with that. Tiabonga, just your take, and I think maybe it's important just to talk about agricultural institutions, colleges, the way you used to work. How are we going to take this forward in light of that as well? Also, just echoing what Kagiso was saying. Thanks.
I think the road ahead is still very long and windy. The reality is there's big gaps and differences between the two sectors. In fact, the gaps becoming wider and wider with the one sector moving further and further ahead, or else the other one remains behind. And I think one of the critical aspects, obviously, is with regards to as much as you can train, people constantly need resources to work with. On the other hand, where you've also got a lot of indigenous farmers, people who are passionate or constantly require and need training and mentoring. And I think, as indicated today, perhaps public sector is also guilty of bringing a lot of Christmas presents, but not nurturing and walking people through. And I think there's something critical also said by Zebion earlier on, whereby we've constantly got to look at what we need and how big it needs to be. It's no good getting a 135 kilowatt tractor or a 300 kilowatt tractor when all I need or all I'm working on basically is a 10 hectare area. But just to touch on training, I think obviously there's still a lot of which needs to be worked on in terms of our training needs and obviously assisting our agricultural institutions in coming to par, which obviously servicing both sectors, the large-scale producers as well as the subsistence or small-scale farmers.
Thank you so much. And I think that this conversation, we can have it 10 times over and we probably won't get there yet. But it is an important conversation to be had. And I'm so grateful for all of you who are here and listening and contributed to this session to understand why fostering our agricultural heritage is so key for growth and what this future looks like. And for all the newbies in the space, please don't be deterred. It's still a very dynamic space to work in. And I think that whoever is here for a reason and for a very clear purpose. So thank you so much. I'll be with you again next week. Do join us again for #FoodFormZanzi's Gather to Grow here on Twitter Spaces. From my side, for now, goodbye and have a lovely evening and enjoy the rest of your week.